In a week where the Middle East has really been dominating the international headlines, attention is gradually turning back to Ukraine. We've got Volodymyr Zelensky, Emmanuel Macron, Donald Trump as well, all suggesting that bringing an end to Russia's invasion is top of their diplomatic wish list. But what, if anything, has changed? Well, Tomahawk missiles continue to drive the discussion as members of the Trump administration publicly flirt with bolstering Kyiv's long-range capabilities. But Moscow is sounding the alarm, and so an ironclad commitment is yet to materialise. President Zelensky, though, is going to be hoping to capitalise on his latest invitation to the White House. He wants to decisively move the dial now and weaken Vladimir Putin's negotiating position. As always, plenty of you have been getting in touch with your questions on the war, and our team are here to answer them.
I'm Olga Robinson.
I'm Mikey K.
And I'm Lucy Hawkins. Welcome to Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
There's going to be plenty of opportunity over the next few days to be analysing all the diplomacy that's going on. So what we wanted to do this week on Ukrainecast is really take a closer look at the security situation where it stands right now. Mikey, remind us what you do here at the BBC.
I have a wonderful show called The Security Brief, which is weekly, which I host with Christian Fraser. And we take deep dives into geopolitical, foreign policy, defence and warfare issues, of which there are plenty at the moment.
And your background?
20 years flying assault helicopters in the British military, 10 combat tours, 3 in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Northern Ireland, and disaster relief and humanitarian assistance after the tsunami in 2004.
Olga, you are known and loved by our Ukrainecast listeners and viewers. So let's press on with some of the questions we've been getting this week. And before we get to them, though, let's take stock of what is happening on the front line right now, because we have had all these reports coming through and they've been pretty consistent about Russia's progress on the front line. But then we started to hear a bit more about the counteroffensives. What's going on?
So there have been some counteroffensives on the Ukrainian side along the front line, but it has to be caveated that we're not talking about major counteroffensive. We're talking about very limited action of taking partially a settlement here or a village there. So it's not overall, if you look at the entirety of a very long stretched over 1,000-kilometer long front line, the developments are very very slow.
So in any given day, how much territory are we talking about?
I've been speaking to experts from the Institute for the Study of War, and they have been saying that overall, on average, Russian troops have been advancing 13.5 square kilometers per day, but that's again stretch across massive territory. And in their opinion, that's much lower than you would expect from modern mechanized warfare.
Yeah, that's the point, isn't it, Mikey? You would normally think that it would be more, this is small and attritional still.
Yeah, and you know, for me, a gain doesn't have to be necessarily a gain in territory. A gain can be actually stopping Russian advancement. So I think, you know, it has to be put into context in terms of troop numbers, armoured numbers, the attack to defence ratio, which is in a rural environment, usually about 3-1. What I mean by that, I mean an attacking force will need 3 times the numbers of a defending force in order to get any form of advantage. That's a 5-1 ratio in an urban environment. So there's lots of factors that go into it.
Yeah. Olga, when I last saw pictures from Ukraine, you can clearly tell the seasons are changing. It was a lot more muddy, it was wet, it was grey. I mean, how are the weather conditions, even in the change in the temperatures, affecting things?
They do actually. The situation is not completely static on the front line. And at the moment, when the weather has turned, the Russians have been trying to take advantage of it because obviously the bad weather would prevent drones from operating as they would in summer or as effectively as in summer. So at the moment we are seeing a bit more of attempts from the Russians to use kind of units to make advances. But again, we're not talking about a breakthrough at all.
Okay, well, let's turn to our first audience question.
Hello, And I'm wondering, what do you think would happen if NATO countries were to start conducting large-scale military exercises along their borders with Russia? Look forward to your answer. Thank you.
Olga.
I mean, they already do on a regular basis, and there's it's scheduled, and we know when they're coming, and the Russians know when they're coming, and it gets picked up regularly on Russian talk shows and by Russian officials who talk endlessly about the aggressiveness of NATO and allies and how Russia is being a victim of Russophobia. But that's very different. These scheduled exercises are very different from, huge gatherings of troops or
I think
Russian
that's what
troops
Andy
on the
is
border.
envisaging, isn't he? He's imagining pictures of vast numbers of troops right on the border. That's the thrust behind his question, I think, and we're not seeing that.
And we're not seeing that, exactly. And it's very different from what we saw happening just in the run-up to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when there were loads of troops just gathering.
If something like this did happen, would it be seen, rightly so, perhaps, Mikey, as preparation for a big attack? That's why you would see something like this happen.
Well, I think NATO's premise is purely defensive, working on Article 5 and collective self-defense. I think the only time NATO's ever got offensive is in Kosovo. But apart from that, it's generally defensive. I think the other big thing is numbers. Does NATO have the ability to be able to, outside of its normal, as Olga was saying, its normal scheduled training exercises, schedule? So, for example, in Finland, there's just been a big exercise up there. But it's more about niche capability. It's more about NATO jets practicing getting airborne from roads in Finland, for example, to have that ability to be able to take jets away from air bases, which are obviously going to be targeted, and putting them in areas which the Russians will find harder. I think I've just been out on Operation Chessman, at an airbase about 50 miles from the Kaliningrad border inside Poland. That was called Chessman. They were getting airborne weekly to intercept Russian aircraft coming out of Kaliningrad. Now, the Kaliningrad bit's interesting because the Russians and the Belarusians have planned a huge training exercise this year, which was all basically centered around the Slovakia Gap, which is about a 65-kilometer border where you have Lithuania to the north and Poland to the south. But it's the only land corridor that joins Russia's exclave of Kaliningrad to any form of ally. And again, that was a show of intent. It was a show of force. My big question was, could NATO have done more to establish maybe brigades of armor around the Slovakia Gap, just to show an intent to say, we know what you're doing. The last time you did this was in 2022, and look what you did. We're on to you. We're not going to let this happen again.
Your example of jets, though, does lead us nicely on to the next question that we've had from Graham.
Hello, Ukrainecast. I can't understand why European countries are not prepared to fly defensive sorties over Ukraine. As a sovereign country, it's not within Russia's authority to say who can fly over Ukraine. Provided the missions are defensive, Russia would have no grounds for escalation. Are we afraid, or am I being too naive?
No, I think it's a great question, but it's very nuanced. So NATO do have quick reaction alert in the Baltic states, for example, Baltic air policing. You've got Amrani base in Estonia, where there are currently Italian F-35s. They launched recently to intercept the 3 Russian MiG-31s that made a 12-minute incursion inside Estonian airbase. It's different when you're talking about a no-fly zone, which I think was the premise of the question. So when you have a no-fly zone, the rules of engagement are very, very different to incursions of enemy aircraft into sovereign airspace. And the potential for escalation in rules of engagement with Russian aircraft that are making incursions over into Ukrainian territory, there's a lot more potential there for things to escalate rapidly. And I think that's what NATO is being incredibly careful of. I think there is a solution where maybe you could look at the western half of Ukraine, which has already been posited, so west of Kyiv, if you like, positioning NATO aircraft inside Lviv, for example, or on the border of Poland, to actually do no-fly zone operations over a certain bit of airspace in Ukraine. So I think, A, it requires capability. B, it requires a formal approval by NATO that they want to do this. And then the third one is, the rules of engagement have to be incredibly meticulous in case you have, some form of ramp up to a shoot down, and then that's obviously going to escalate potentially.
We're all still talking a lot about Tomahawks. It's the word on everyone's lips still. Before we get to the next question, actually, Mikey, can you quickly remind us what a Tomahawk is?
Yeah, commonly known as a TLAM, Tomahawk Land Attack Missile. It's got a range of about 1,000 miles. It's a cruise missile. 1,000 miles is about 1,600 kilometers. Predominantly designed to be launched from warships or submarines. Submarines have what's called a VLS, a vertical launch system. And so in order to make a Tomahawk land attack missile launchable from a land environment, there needs to be a different launcher system designed. And the Americans have done that with something called Typhon. That is 4 battery units. It's just been deployed to an area just outside of Hiroshima in Japan. So launched, usually flies in at incredibly low level to avoid radar, and then pops up and then hits the target on a GPS.
Okay, well, we've had a question from Mark who asks, it seems that Trump has learnt to use the element of surprise in weapons supply much better than his predecessor. So I wonder what damage an unannounced Tomahawk attack could do to biggest effect. Do we think it would be unannounced? And Olga, I mean, is there a sense here that maybe a deal has already been done and we're just waiting for an announcement?
We don't really know. We don't have details on that. But technically, I've been speaking to military experts to kind of get an understanding if this will be a game changer per se. And they have been saying that, well, there's an issue. Obviously, these weapons are more precise and would have a bigger impact on the on Russian targets quite deep inside Russian territory, because at the moment Ukraine is deploying drones that fly quite deep into Russian territory to attack oil refineries. But obviously a missile and a precision weapon would make way more damage, but also it would potentially make more protected military targets that are at the moment out of reach of Ukrainian weapons more vulnerable. However, there is an issue of just how much of Tomahawks the US can spare. And one expert was telling me that's realistically about 20 to 30, which means that they would effectively be a scalpel in the Ukrainian arsenal, but not a scythe.
I think the big part here, though, is it's not just about the Tomahawk land attack missile. In order to make that effective, you've got to have intelligence which provides Ukraine with a good target set. Historically, that intelligence has been coming from the US. So, as we saw with the ATACMS under the Biden administration, Ukraine was given the HIMARS launcher, which has the ATACMS missile, but they were constrained by where they could use that. So it was originally only in Russian targets inside Ukraine territory, and then they were given approval to deep strike inside Russia. And as Olga says, there are different tranches of a TLAM. You've got the latest tranche, which is, more accurate, longer range, harder to detect. You've got the earlier tranches, which is probably what the US would give them. But what Ukraine needs along with that is the intelligence to go with it that allows them to target the infrastructure and the military target sets that would actually have a significant effect.
Well, from missiles to drones, and we've had this question in from James in Cheltenham, who says, given that clearly we are in a new era of warfare, could the UK's readiness extend to supporting and learning from Ukrainian drone warfare and perhaps investing in and supplying new drones for the Ukrainians to field test in order to strengthen our own capabilities, as well as help Ukraine defend itself now? I ask because it seems that in comparison to NATO, Russia has the clear advantage of experience in this area. And as we've seen, this is an area that can have a significant impact tactically on the battlefield and also strategically. Mikey, is James right? Does Russia have the clear advantage when it comes to drones?
Russia is doing a very good job of collaborating with China in terms of bolstering volume of capability and accuracy of capability for sure. We've already seen on social media some of these huge factories in central Russia that are just churning out Garand 2s, which are effectively look like a V, but they're black. Russia is volume-wise dealing with that through its collaborations with China. But in terms of technology, Ukraine really is on the coalface. And it's doing that from a defensive posture analyzing what the Russians have got and then finding out a new way of countering that and then getting the advantage. I think it does this, right? It's a pendulum swing. No one has the advantage for too long before someone then thinks of a way of going around that. A classic example is the what's called fiber optic FPV, fiber optic first person drones. Now, the constraint with a fiber optic FPV is that it's only got a range of about 30 kilometers, but because it's got a fiber optic cable coming out the back of it, it means that there's no way of countering it. You can't put radio frequency out there. You can only shoot it down. Or what the Ukrainians have been doing is that they've been putting big nets up over the lines of communication that are used to resupply. And they've been trying to counter it that way. But that's a short-term capability, a short range capability. Then, as Olga was saying, you've got, other drones that are able to travel, 1,000 kilometers, 2,000 kilometers with a GPS coordinate and be quite accurate. And obviously that's where the TLAM conversation comes in as well. So I just, when we think about drones, we can't just think about drones as one entity. We've got to think about them across the broad of effects-based operations that they're being used to deploy against.
And Olga, what about James's question around the UK and its readiness to support and learn from Ukrainian drone warfare and invest and supply? And that's already happening in quite a big way, isn't it?
Well, according to the UK government, they're already doing it, and it has been increasing its support to Ukraine, and it has begun collecting data from the battlefield to create new tech, and also around 600 million pounds has been invested this year to accelerate drone delivery to Ukraine's armed forces. And also the Defense Secretary in the UK said to allies this week that we need to ramp up drone production to outmatch Putin's escalation following increased strikes in Ukraine and also incursions in Europe that we have seen fairly recently. So they are already doing it. I think generally this is a sentiment more widely in Europe, because when we speak to military experts, they all say there's a lot of willingness to learn from Ukraine. But I also wanted to, just off the back of what Mikey was saying, I think chimes really well with what Ukrainian drone operators have been telling me. We've been speaking to them on and off in the past few months, and they say that Ukraine is really good at innovating when it comes to drone warfare, and they were the pioneers when it comes to the full-scale invasion of just using this really relatively cheap technology to try and stave off Russian.
I mean, we've talked about it before, but there are little drone factories everywhere, all over Ukraine. Drones are being made by the most unexpected people.
Yeah. But at the same time, they have been telling us, and it's multiple people saying the same thing, that Russia is very good at spotting innovation and then thinking, okay, this is good, we can use that, and then just going away and making and producing it at large scale, in some cases where Ukraine can't actually match it in terms of just sheer number of drones.
I was speaking to some drone operators the other day that have been operating inside Ukraine, and the way that what's called a TTPs, tactics, training and procedures, are evolving, just incredible. So now the Russians will put up a loiter UAV drone specifically to target the drone operator. So what they're now doing is they're going onto the Ukrainians are going onto the front line. They'll put out the person with the controller. It's like a gaming console, if you like, which has a monitor on it, which is linked to the camera in the drone. And the controller, the person flying the drone, will use what's called an RF frequency, a radio frequency that goes from the controller to the drone that allows you to fly the drone in the way that you want to do. That radio frequency bit can be identified, tracked and targeted by a Russian loiter drone. And then if that has weapons on it, it can then target the person who's flying the drone. So the evolution of the way the tactics, training and procedures is evolving is rapid. It's an exponential curve, and they're always thinking of ways through decoys or through fiber optic first-person drones to try and get around it. The other thing I'd say as well is on the defense side, it's not just about Ukrainian evolution of drone technology. And in the counter space, I was talking to a company the other day called Nordic Air Defense, and they've designed effectively this carbon fiber. It looks like a big bullet, which has a battery-operated motor on the back and a very sensitive targeting system that can be employed in salvos of 4 all the way up to 100. So you can launch 100 of these at the same time. It's got a speed of about 450 kilometers an hour. It can maneuver in the air. That's the type of technology that will start to address the volumes of drones coming across. And Ukraine obviously also has to be open and looking out there for not just organic capabilities from lessons learned, but this is a tech startup. The guy that set this company up, it's his third company, and he's hired 4 whiz kids from Silicon Valley to come in and design this. And what's brilliant about this specific capability is normal procurement takes months and years to affect any small change within what's called the user requirement document. These guys are doing it in weeks.
We've been talking about the change of seasons and how it's affecting things on the front line in Ukraine. Well, we've had another question from Ken and Harrow, and it is around the change in the seasons and how it's affecting people.
Hi, Ukrainecast. This is Ken from Harrow. Here we're gearing up for Halloween and the November bonfires and fireworks. What do people in Ukraine do to mark this change of the season, and what would I see if I was there? And what is the mood as the war goes into its 4th winter?
Olga, in terms of the winter, there had been a sense that Ukraine, it wasn't going to be too bad in terms of preparations, that they'd done a lot. But how bad has it been this week? How disruptive, how devastating have these attacks been on oil and gas facilities?
Really bad. I think one of the Ukrainian officials has said that some of the attacks have been the worst on their energy infrastructure. And we have seen, there was this last Friday, there was this spectacular video when there's an impact, I assume, of a missile, because it's quite, you can see quite fire in the background. And then just parts of Kiev just go dark completely. And it's, unfortunately, it is a very common, like, everyday reality in Ukraine. And we are most likely going to see more of it because ACLED think tank that tracks war developments across the world, they've counted in September, there were 90 attacks, Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and that's up by a third compared to an average of the previous 3 months.
I think one of the important aspects of that is, as well as obviously there's a huge impact on civilians, but there's also going to be impact on the ability for the Ukrainian defense industrial base, which requires electricity to keep generating a lot of the equipment and capability that they're using. So it's kind of looking at the impact on that as well.
The knock-on effects on both. Halloween, Olga. Do Ukrainians care? Celebrate? What's the feeling about Halloween?
Some do, but I think it's more of a on the younger side, the millennials, the Gen Z.
Those who've been influenced by American culture, perhaps?
Yes, well, it hasn't really been a thing in the post-Soviet space until well into the 2000s. And in Ukraine, I've been speaking to some friends and they said, well, there will be some clubs and decorations, but it's not really something that the entire nation is looking for.
I mean, the kids go trick-or-treating? No, that's
not really. Like I've never, I lived in Russia for 30 plus years and I've never done this. And the first time I've done it was with my then 3-year-old who was very excited. But it was here.
But the older generation probably think, the babushkas are thinking, there's some demons and bad spirits around it. They don't just think,
they say.
They say.
Whenever, because I remember we were once, it was back in Russia, and I was in my early 20s, and my friend and I went to one of those club parties I was dressed as an angel, and she was dressed as death. And then we just walked, we didn't have money for the taxi, so we just walked into a public bus, and the driver just looks at us and says, "Oh my goodness," and he started praying.
Well, on that note, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back with a new Q&A episode, of course, next week. But in the meantime, don't forget you can check out our Ukrainecast feed wherever you get your BBC podcasts for plenty more analysis from the team. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.